What if I told you every generation, no matter how civilized the era looks in hindsight, still produces monsters? Some hide behind money and architecture, some behind charm, uniforms, or a friendly smile, and some are so young that the world struggles to decide what justice even means. Today, we're walking through 7 infamous killers, matched to the generation they're often linked to, and by the end you tell me, which generation feels the most terrifying? 1. The Lost Generation, 1883-1900, H. Holmes in the Murder Hotel. Chicago in the 1890s was booming. Crowds, opportunity, and chaos. In the middle of that noise, one man blended in perfectly. H. Holmes, a smooth-talking businessman with a talent for appearing respectable. He didn't need a dark alley. He built his own hunting ground. Holmes invested in a large building that looked, from the outside, like a normal hotel. But inside, it was reportedly designed like a puzzle. Hallways that didn't make sense, rooms with strange features, and spaces built to isolate people from help. Investigators later described a structure that seemed made to confuse, trap, and conceal, with hidden areas and routes leading toward the basement. Downstairs was where the story turns truly chilling. Authorities reported finding evidence of methods meant to dispose of remains and erase traces, tools and setups that suggested planning, not impulse. This wasn't a crime of the moment. It was a system. What made Holmes especially dangerous was how ordinary he could look. He often targeted people who trusted him, especially women, using romance, promises, and paperwork. Many accounts describe a pattern: gaining control of someone's assets, pushing them into dependence, and then watching them vanish from public life. Estimates around the number of victims vary wildly, and legends grew over time. But the core idea remains. Holmes represents a nightmare of that era. A killer who weaponized the rapid growth of a city and turned architecture into an accomplice. When he was finally caught, he reportedly spoke with an unnerving calm, as if the truth didn't bother him. Holmes was convicted and executed in 1896, but the image of that building and what it symbolized still lingers like a ghost in Chicago's history. 2. The Greatest Generation, 1901 to 1927. Albert Fish, the Brooklyn Nightmare. This generation is remembered for endurance, surviving economic collapse and global war. But even in an era praised for strength, darkness existed in the shadows. One of the most disturbing figures linked to this time is Albert Fish. Fish's early life was marked by instability and hardship, and accounts of his later behavior suggest a deeply disturbed mind. Over the years, he became associated with horrific crimes involving children, cases that terrified families and left entire communities on edge. Some claims surrounding his total number of victims were exaggerated, but what investigators could prove was already beyond shocking. The case that ultimately exposed him began with a long con. Fish approached a family by presenting himself as trustworthy, someone helpful, polite, and believable. He gained access, built confidence, and then lured a child away. After that, the child disappeared, and the family was left in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Years later, the break in the case came not from advanced technology or genius detective work, but from arrogance. Fish sent a letter to the victim's mother, describing details that no outsider should know. That single act, cruel and calculated, became the thread police pulled until the entire disguise unraveled. Once arrested, Fish confessed to crimes with a cold detachment that stunned investigators. In court, the case became a symbol of pure horror, an example of how evil can hide behind a weak, quiet, harmless-looking exterior. Albert Fish was executed by electric chair in 1936, but his story still circulates today as a warning. Sometimes the most frightening predator is the one who doesn't look like a predator at all. 3. The Silent Generation, 1928 to 1945. Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Before Dusseldorf became a name associated with modern nightlife and river views, it was once a city holding its breath. In the late 1920s, headlines didn't talk about fashion or festivals. They talked about a predator. Someone was attacking people in the dark, and the pattern was so strange, so brutal, that the press gave him a name that sounded like a horror novel. Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Here's what made this case different from ordinary murder investigations. The fear wasn't limited to one neighborhood. It spread like smoke. Parents stopped letting kids walk alone. Couples avoided quiet streets. Police patrols increased, but it didn't matter. Because the attacks didn't follow a clean rulebook. Victims differed. Locations shifted. The city couldn't predict where the next scream would come from. Kürten's early life, according to many accounts, was a perfect storm of poverty, violence, and abuse. And instead of breaking the cycle, he became the cycle. What investigators later uncovered suggested a man driven by violent compulsions, someone who didn't just want to kill, but wanted the terror itself. In some reports, he was described as being fascinated by blood and the reactions of his victims, which only intensified the panic gripping Düsseldorf. The investigation turned into a pressure cooker. Every wrong lead wasted time. Every new victim fueled public outrage. And the worst part? People began suspecting everyone. Neighbors, strangers, even family members. When a city reaches that point, the killer isn't just hurting victims, he's poisoning daily life. So how did police finally close in? Not through a cinematic genius moment, but through the slow tightening of the net. Witness descriptions, suspicious behavior, and the kind of police work that stacks small facts until they become a wall. Kürten was arrested, and what followed shocked even hardened investigators. He confessed. Multiple murders, numerous attempted murders. A trail of violence that explained why an entire city had been living in fear. The trial became a national spectacle. Newspapers devoured every detail. People wanted answers, but what they got was something worse. Confirmation that the monster wasn't supernatural. He was human, and that was the most frightening part. Peter Kürten was executed in 1931. But the legacy of the case remained. Düsseldorf learned the hard way that when a killer turns fear into a weapon, the whole city becomes a crime scene, even if you never see the blood. For the baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. Ed Gein, the Plainfield Ghoul. Now we step into an era people romanticize. Post-war America, small towns, front porches, and the illusion that evil only lives in big cities. But Plainfield, Wisconsin proved something chilling. Sometimes the quietest places hide the loudest nightmares. Ed Gein didn't look like a horror icon. He looked like a harmless loner, awkward, soft-spoken, the kind of guy locals might describe as odd, but not dangerous. And that's exactly why the story hits so hard, because no one expects the monster to come wrapped in awkward smiles and silence. Gein's life revolved around his mother. Their bond wasn't just close, it was consuming. She reportedly controlled his world, fed him paranoia about impure women, and kept him isolated from normal relationships. When she died, something in Gein didn't just break, it emptied out. And in that emptiness, an obsession grew, one tied to death, identity, and a disturbing attempt to recreate what he'd lost. For years, strange rumors floated around Plainfield. People whispered about graveyards, about missing items, about a man who was out at night when he shouldn't be. But nobody imagined the truth until a woman named Bernice Worden, who ran a local hardware store, vanished in November 1957. She was last seen in contact with Gein. That one detail was enough for police to act. When officers searched Gein's isolated farmhouse, they expected a clue. Instead, they walked into a crime scene so grotesque it redefined horror in the American imagination. Investigators reported finding human remains and objects made from body parts, items crafted like trophies, as if the house itself was a museum of the dead. This wasn't a moment of rage. It was ritual-like collecting. Slow, deliberate, secret. And here's the part that makes Gein different from the killers who chase numbers. His terror wasn't in speed, it was in obsession. He wasn't hunting crowded streets. He was building a private nightmare behind closed doors, piece by piece, for years. The idea that this could exist unnoticed in a rural town is what still unsettles people today. The legal aftermath also added to the shock. Gein was diagnosed with severe mental illness and was found unfit to stand trial at points in the process. Rather than a typical prison sentence, he spent most of his remaining life confined to psychiatric institutions. He died in custody in 1984, but the cultural damage was permanent. Ed Gein became a blueprint for countless fictional villains, not because his story is cool, but because it exposed a terrifying truth. Sometimes horror doesn't kick down the door. Sometimes it lives quietly down the road, and nobody looks too closely until it's too late. 5. Generation X, 1965 to 1980. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. If the last story proved that evil can hide in a quiet town, This one proves something even worse. Evil can hide in plain sight while people applaud it. John Wayne Gacy wasn't some mysterious drifter. He was the guy who shook hands, joined community events, and knew how to look like a success. He ran businesses, socialized, and presented himself as the kind of person you'd trust around your family. And that normal mask wasn't a detail. It was his greatest weapon. Gacy understood something terrifying about society. We are trained to trust appearances. So he built an image that disarmed suspicion. Sometimes he even dressed as a clown, pogo, to entertain at events. That detail became legendary later because it twisted something harmless into something people could never see the same way again. Behind the public smile, investigators say Gacy targeted teenage boys and young men, often luring them with promises, work opportunities, money, favors, or simply a friendly invitation. Once he had them isolated, the mask came off, and the crimes didn't happen somewhere else. They happened where he felt safest, on his own property. For years, disappearances happened around him like background noise. And here's the sick part. The reason it lasted so long was not just his manipulation, it was that people didn't want to believe it. Families asked questions, rumors spread, but Gacy's respectable persona bought him time. In true crime, that's one of the most painful patterns. When the monster looks like a neighbor, society hesitates. The case finally began to crack when one disappearance led investigators back to him, and the pressure didn't stop. As police dug deeper, they uncovered evidence that didn't match the friendly businessman's story. Then came the moment that still makes people's stomach drop. A search of his home revealed human remains, many of them, hidden beneath the house. Imagine realizing the place you considered just another house was actually a burial site. The scale of it was shocking. In the end, Gacy was convicted of killing 33 young men and boys, making him one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1994. But his legacy didn't die with him. The killer clown image spread into pop culture because it captured something primal. The fear that the people we trust most, the ones with the loudest smiles, might be hiding the darkest rooms. And this is why Gacy remains a generational nightmare. Not because he was the smartest killer, but because he exploited the simplest weakness. So here's the question. If someone can look respectable enough to fool a whole community, how many red flags do we ignore every day just because the mask is convincing?